This account details the extraordinary federal courtroom testimony from the Sean Diddy Combs trial, as documented by Inner City Press. The proceedings took an unexpected turn when an unannounced witness was called to testify. Without prior notice or media speculation, Denzel Washington entered the courtroom. The acclaimed actor, known for his dignity and discretion, appeared not for publicity but to share a burden he had carried silently for years. His revelations would transform what seemed like a standard celebrity trial into something far more disturbing. Washington appeared composed yet determined as he approached the witness stand, dressed simply in a black suit and blue tie, carrying only a folded paper. The brief eye contact between him and Diddy revealed an unmistakable tension before the defendant looked away. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Journalists scrambled to document the moment, their pens suddenly heavy with anticipation. The judge's gavel struck sharply, restoring order. "I am not here today as a celebrity," Washington began, his voice calm but resolute, but as a man who can no longer stay silent. He unfolded the paper with deliberate care. It was a letter dated over a decade ago, one he said he'd received anonymously, but had verified through private channels. The contents, he claimed, detailed a network of abuse and manipulation that stretched far beyond the current charges. The room held its breath. Diddy shifted in his chair, his legal team whispering urgently. But Washington didn't flinch. "I've carried this letter for years, waiting for the right moment. That moment is now." The courtroom, once buzzing with the typical cadence of celebrity scandal, was silent, caught between disbelief and dawning comprehension. This was no longer just a trial. It was the opening of a deeper, darker chapter, one that would challenge the very fabric of what the public thought they knew. And Denzel Washington had just lit the match. After being sworn in, Washington explained his presence with measured words. He couldn't continue living with his silence. The courtroom leaned in as he spoke, not as an actor, but as a witness to something larger than himself. He admitted he had avoided this moment for months, battling with the weight of what his testimony might mean. This wasn't about revenge, he clarified. This was about confronting unchecked power, about accountability in places where silence had too long been the currency. "I didn't want to be here," he said, voice steady but shadowed with pain. "But I couldn't keep living with what I knew." He then painted a vivid picture of the early 2000s, a time when hip-hop and Hollywood collided in a cultural explosion. He recalled parties where industry elites mingled with rising moguls, where music met movies, and money flowed without limits. At the center of it all, he said, was Diddy. At first, Diddy's confidence was seen as ambition, magnetic, maybe even admirable. But over time, Washington began noticing a shift. The charm sharpened into control. The language turned darker. There were whispers that stopped when he walked into a room. Faces that changed when Diddy entered. "You learn to read people in this business," Washington said. Something was changing in him. The energy around him, it grew cold. Heavy. His voice dropped slightly as he added, "People got scared. I was one of them." The courtroom, once quick to dismiss this case as another celebrity scandal, now sat motionless. Denzel Washington had just cracked open the facade, and what lay behind it was only beginning to come into view. The testimony took a shocking turn when Washington leaned forward, voice low, and said, "This goes beyond anything I ever expected to share." He then revealed an allegation so surreal, the courtroom shifted from curiosity to stunned disbelief. Diddy had been planning a private space mission not as an escape, but as a sanctuary to continue his most controversial activities beyond Earth's legal reach. Washington described a 2020 retreat in the Nevada desert lavish, isolated, and strangely secretive. It was there, he said, that Diddy first unveiled the concept. Not a space hotel. Not a tourism venture. But something else entirely. He called it the Heaven Lounge, Washington recalled. Said it would be the first entertainment capsule in orbit. The designs were surreal, lead-lit floors pulsing like a nightclub heartbeat, deep velvet seating shaped like crescent moons, and soundproof chambers designed for what Diddy allegedly called uninhibited experience. Washington said Diddy showed him renderings with rotating guest lists, only those handpicked for their loyalty, their silence, and their usefulness. "He told me," Washington continued, "up there are no rules. No eyes. No interruptions. A hush fell over the courtroom as the implications sank in, not just a misuse of power, but the blueprint of a boundaryless domain. No laws. No press. Just orbiting silence. By the time Washington stepped down from the witness stand, it was clear, this was no longer just a trial. It had become a reckoning, one that might stretch all the way to the stars. The plan, prosecutors later dubbed it Project Exodus, a name that sent chills through the courtroom. Washington testified that this wasn't some idle fantasy but a meticulously crafted scheme, backed by serious financial muscle. Billionaire tech investors and aerospace partners had poured money into the venture, fueling ambitions that stretched far beyond the Earth's atmosphere. Washington revealed that Diddy had quietly acquired a swath of land near a remote launch site in South America, far from the watchful eyes of any government agency. The site was described as a private celestial arts platform, a euphemism for something far more ominous. The spacecraft itself wasn't designed for scientific exploration or space tourism. Instead, according to Washington, it existed only as a prototype in sophisticated simulation software, crafted less like a vessel for discovery and more like a floating luxury trap. Plush interiors, advanced soundproofing, and immersive lighting systems, everything engineered to keep passengers comfortable and contained. Diddy's passenger list was equally telling. It included disgraced entertainment figures and athletes, men who had reasons to vanish from public view. They had all reportedly signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements after attending exclusive parties where loyalty was currency, and silence was mandatory. Washington's voice dropped as he described the chilling implications. This wasn't just a spaceship, he said. It was a refuge for those who wanted to disappear and for the power players to operate beyond the reach of any law. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Project Exodus was no longer a distant rumor, it was a dark plan unfolding right before their eyes, threatening to redefine the boundaries of justice itself. The plan nearly succeeded until a whistleblower came forward. A contractor, uneasy with the unusual modifications being made to the spacecraft, broke ranks. Their discomfort with the secretive alterations sparked a federal investigation that intensified throughout 2023, pulling back the curtain on Project Exodus. By early 2024, the authorities had pieced together enough evidence to act. In a dramatic raid at a remote launch site in Suriname, they arrested Diddy just weeks before his planned departure in March. The capsule itself was discovered fully loaded not with scientific equipment, but with party supplies, blackout materials, and stimulants. It was clear this was no ordinary space mission. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered that Diddy had systematically transferred ownership of his U.S. properties to shell corporations, an elaborate move suggesting this wasn't a temporary escape but a carefully orchestrated plan for permanent departure. The courtroom was left grappling with the implications. A man at the peak of fame, orchestrating a secret exodus from Earth to evade accountability, backed by the very power and privilege that had once defined him. Washington's testimony closed with a somber reflection. This was more than an escape plan. It was a final act of control, an attempt to rewrite the rules on a cosmic scale. The judge's gavel came down, but the echoes of the case would linger long after the courtroom emptied. Project Exodus was stopped for now, but the question remained, how far will those with unchecked power go to avoid the consequences? Washington's most disturbing testimony took a deeply personal turn as he spoke about Diddy's treatment of his own children. He recounted a chilling incident from 2016 at Diddy's sprawling Beverly Hills estate, a night that stayed with him ever since. That evening, Washington witnessed what he described as outright abuse. He heard threatening language hurled at family members, words heavy with anger and control. It was a side of Diddy few had ever seen, far from the charismatic public figure, revealing a darker, more violent presence behind closed doors. But this was not an isolated moment. Over the years, Washington testified, he observed a disturbing pattern. Children at Diddy's lavish parties weren't treated like family, but rather like servants. They were expected to obey not through guidance or care, but through domination and fear. Discipline, he said, was replaced by control. When Washington finally confronted Diddy privately in 2018, hoping to voice his concern, the response was cold and unyielding. Diddy told him, "You raise lions by throwing them to the wolves." A chilling mantra that framed cruelty as strength, fear as preparation, and control as love. The courtroom fell silent as Washington's words echoed through the room. This was no longer just a story about power or scandal, it was about broken families and the devastating impact of unchecked authority in the most intimate of spaces. And in that moment, the public's perception of a man once idolized was irrevocably changed. In a moment of painful honesty, Washington confessed something he had carried quietly for years, a deep sense of failure. Despite witnessing numerous warning signs, despite seeing the troubling behavior unfold before his eyes, he had stayed silent. The fear that gripped him was real. And it was shared by many others in the celebrity world who had seen the same troubling patterns but chose silence over exposure. He described how the very real threat of losing careers, reputations, and even personal safety created an invisible cage around those who might have spoken out. It wasn't just fear for myself, Washington said softly, but fear for my family and for the families of those who came to me for help. He revealed receiving anonymous pleas, letters, calls, messages from those trapped within the orbit of power. One came from a former employee of Diddy, reaching out in desperation, seeking a lifeline. But Washington admitted he failed to respond. Not out of indifference, but paralyzed by the risks involved. The cost was too high, he explained. Speaking out could have meant everything crashing down, not just for me, but for those I cared about. His voice faltered as he looked around the courtroom. I regret that silence every day. The weight of his admission settled heavily over everyone present. It was a stark reminder that the glamour and glitz of fame often mask a far darker reality, where fear and power silence even those most desperately hoping for change. Washington's testimony was not just about reckoning with Diddy's actions. It was a call to break the cycle of silence and confront the price of complicity. Washington exposed the hidden infrastructure that had long enabled Diddy's behavior, a complex and ruthless machine powered by networks of publicists, lawyers, and corporate executives. These were the unseen players working tirelessly behind the scenes, maintaining a carefully constructed facade while actively covering up wrongdoing. He described specialized cleanup crews, teams that arrived immediately after high-profile events to erase any trace of what had transpired. Physical evidence was removed, digital files wiped, and emotional scars quietly managed away from the public eye. These crews operated like ghosts, erasing history to protect a powerful empire. Washington's testimony took a darker turn when he revealed finding hard drives filled with footage, videos of guests who had no idea they were being recorded. The content, he said, was deeply troubling. Studio executives even warned him about these files, cautioning that their release could cause irreparable damage. But the most chilling element was the legal web woven to keep victims silent. Attendees were handed NDAs disguised as party RSVPs, contracts that legally bound them to secrecy. Washington testified these documents carried harsh consequences. Anyone who dared speak out faced the very real threat of career destruction. The courtroom absorbed the gravity of Washington's words. This was not just about one man's actions but an entire system built to protect privilege at any cost. A system where truth was suppressed, and power was the ultimate shield. As Washington concluded, it was clear. Dismantling this machine would require courage from more than just one witness, it would demand a reckoning that shook the foundations of fame itself. In his concluding statement, Washington turned his gaze directly toward Diddy, his voice steady but charged with conviction. You cannot escape the truth by leaving this planet, he declared. The courtroom fell silent, hanging on every word. Washington made it clear that had Diddy succeeded in launching Project Exodus, his private space mission, it wouldn't have been an escape, but an abandonment. He would have left behind more victims, Washington said, more silence. More suffering concealed by distance and darkness. His words were not meant to seek heroism or applause. Instead, they carried the weight of responsibility, a call to end what he described as madness. Madness for the victims who had suffered in silence, for the voiceless children caught in the crossfire, and for those who never survived the cruelty hidden behind closed doors. A successful space launch would have meant one thing, Washington stressed, that the abuse never ended. That those who should have been protected were instead left alone, unheard, and forgotten. The courtroom absorbed the gravity of his statement. It was a sobering reminder that no matter how far one tries to flee from earth, from law, from conscience, the truth remains. It follows. It demands reckoning. Washington's final words weren't just a conclusion to a testimony, they were a challenge, a plea for justice, for courage, and for an end to the cycle of silence and abuse. In that moment, the fight was no longer about a man or a plan. It was about ensuring that the darkness he sought to escape would never again be hidden in the shadows. Washington departed the courtroom as quietly as he had entered, leaving behind a profound silence that hung heavy in the air. His testimony was more than just a recounting of individual crimes, it was a piercing revelation of a system designed to protect power at the expense of the most vulnerable. For the first time during the entire trial, even Diddy was left speechless. He sat with his hands covering his face, the weight of the allegations and revelations pressing down like a physical force. The bravado, the confidence, all vanished in that moment of stark reckoning. What had started as another celebrity scandal had been transformed before everyone's eyes. This was no longer about fame or fortune, it had become an unflinching examination of how power, wealth, and influence can weave a web so strong that it shields perpetrators while silencing victims. Washington's words revealed systems so deeply entrenched, so meticulously maintained, that they almost stretched beyond the boundaries of this world, systems that nearly found a refuge beyond Earth itself. The courtroom was left grappling with a truth few had dared to confront, that unchecked power doesn't just corrupt, it constructs invisible prisons where silence is demanded and justice is delayed. As Washington stepped into the hallway, his presence faded, but the echo of his testimony would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls, igniting a conversation that no one could afford to ignore.